Easy Explain, The Empiricism of David Hume, Part 1. Starting with a little background. Just going over that David Hume was Scottish. We're still technically still working within British empiricism, but properly speaking, he was Scottish. Why are we covering Hume? Well, he wrote a pretty significant influential work known as an Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Notice the similarities to the title of both Locke's and Berkeley's pieces. He is just going to be following their train of thought, working right off of them. But the thing that distinguishes Hume is that he works more so with causality. So getting into what he says about causes and effects, causation, causality, there's a few ways to say this. His big claim is that they're not necessarily related, at least not the way that we think that they are. He comes up with this new term that he names customs. For him, it's not exactly what you might think is not might be the most popular use of that term, customs, but they're predictions about habits of the world. He says, as you live and experience things, your brain is creating these. They're not always true or guaranteed, right? So what we think, what we expect to always happen is not given. And he gives us a different name to this problem when he expands on it a little bit more. He calls it the is-ought problem. You may have heard of this before in popular philosophy. But just because something is or has happened doesn't mean that it always will happen that way, right? Just because something is doesn't mean that's the way it should be. And as we get into his enquiry, he does divide it into 12 sections. But I'm just going to jump throughout, right? This is supposed to be a little more focused, just looking at where he's talking about customs largely. So not going to be covering the entire text. But starting in section 2, which he names on the origin or of the origin of ideas. A bit of a long one here to start things. So again, like we've done in some videos in the past, feel free to pause and read it for yourself. If I read this out, it would take me quite a while. But essentially, he's just setting up what he really means when he's talking about ideas, what he's talking about thoughts and impressions, differentiating between senses and perceptions and experiences and how we combine them all in our mind. But to end section 2 here, I will read this one. Hume says, all our ideas or more feeble perceptions are copies of our impressions or more lively ones. I thought that was a good summary of how he's distinguishing these key conceptual terms he's using. But then to jump up to section 4, where he really starts to consider these doubts he has about human understanding. In part 1, he says causes and effects are discoverable not by reason but by experience, right? This is what really sorts him into that empiricist camp. And he says every effect is distinct from its cause. Definitely separating them as two distinct entities. Moving into part 2, again, we have a very big one, a very long selection I think is great. Again, feel free to pause, read this, come back to the video. But to end things, I will focus down here on the last part of it, where Hume says, it is impossible, therefore, that any arguments from experience can prove this resemblance of the past to the future, since all these arguments are founded on the supposition of that resemblance. So he's really setting up this problem he has with assuming all effects directly follow causes, or that causes are in fact the causes of effects. So we're sowing the seeds of doubt here. This is part 1, and part 2 we're going to look at how he resolves these things, his solutions to these problems. But for now, I hope that helps.